Welcome back to the Politics of Survival. I'm your host, Tara Reade, and we have a very special guest. Actually, it's a geopolitical journalist that I have, an international journalist who I have followed for a long time, and I've greatly admired his work. And now I even get to be in the same town as he is, as I'm in Moscow, Russia, as all of you know, living here now under political asylum. And I am so happy to introduce a colleague, an international journalist, Steve Sweeney. Steve, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
It's fabulous to have you. So Steve was first on the scene. For the audience that may not know, there was a bombing of a market in Donetsk, and we all know the Donbass region has been battered for years by the Kiev regime. And he was first on the scene of this really horrific bombing that took the lives of so many civilians. So Steve, let's start there. And if you could kind of describe what you saw that day. And of course, we'll be including clips of that in the show, but of your reporting. But if you could discuss that a little bit.
So I'm here just to make sure the clip gets played. It's me, Reef. Normally I'm running the board, so let me play this clip, which, because of its graphic nature, I will have to blur a lot of it. But here is Steve Sweeney talking about that market bombing right here.
Donetsk has come under fire once again, with Ukrainian forces targeting a densely populated civilian area at around 3 o'clock on Monday afternoon. As you can see here, there's a scene of total devastation. Cars have been destroyed and there are at least 2 dead bodies. Now, we have to underline once again that this is not a military area. Just behind us, if we come around here, we can see that this is a supermarket. It would have been packed with people doing their shopping. This is one of the most popular supermarkets in the city. So this is a civilian area, the Kalininsky district of Donetsk. We've heard artillery fire and drones across the course of today, including the Kirovsky district of the city. This is where the marketplace attack, in which 27 people were killed in a Ukrainian shelling just over a week ago. So this has come under heavy bombardment again, with Western supplied weapons and drones. We're on the scene. Emergency services and investigators are here working away behind us. Of course, we don't want to stay here for too long. There have been warnings for people to take shelter, and areas such as these are often prone to what we call double tap attacks. But people in the area are calling this another act of terror.
But while we were filming, our crew were forced to run for cover as we came under fire. It's not clear if we were deliberately targeted, but shelling journalists and emergency workers is stock in trade for Ukraine. With a busy supermarket just yards away, the death toll could have been much higher. In another day of tragedy, 3 people are dead, and the bodies pile up as the West turns the other way.
So yeah, that was Sweeney getting the reporting on the ground. Anyway, back to the show.
Of course, well, just to set the scene, this was a Sunday morning here in Donetsk. Actually, me and the crew had gone to record something completely different. We were in the city centre at Lenin Square, where the statue of Lenin is, and it was the 100th anniversary of his death. So we'd arranged to meet with the Donetsk Communist Party, who were laying flowers there, and then we were going to go to an art gallery where there's an exhibition of paintings of Lenin from across Russia, across all the various Russian regions that have been painted over the years. So we were kind of preparing for that. And it was a bright, clear blue, sunny day, which for most people is a sight of joy when they wake up and they see this. But for the people of Donetsk, it carries a very significant threat, because the clear blue skies make it easier for drones to hit their targets. It makes it easier for artillery shells to also to hit their targets as well. So but of course, this happens every day. Shelling happens every day here in the Donetsk People's Republic. We're constantly subjected to shelling from Western supplied weapons, from drone attacks, from all sorts of. I mean, it's been going on for the last 10 years, as you'll know, and your viewers will know. But this was perhaps the worst attack in 2 years, the worst single deadly attack. 27 people were killed. But like I said, I remember going to get a coffee, and the news filtered through that there'd been an artillery strike, a Ukrainian attack on a marketplace. We heard that one person had died. By the time I'd got my coffee, it was 3 people. And when we were making our way to the scene, it had risen to 8. And by the time I arrived, which was, I guess, maybe 30 minutes after the last of the shelling attacks, we'd been told that there were 13 people confirmed dead. Obviously, that rose, and you could tell that there was more than 13 people that had been killed there. So this was in a marketplace, and I say a marketplace, it's really one of these, like a ramshackled covered market. And on the side of the road, which is where a lot of the victims were, these were babushkas, dedushkas, old men and old women. And as you see, even in Moscow, you see them, but you see them a lot here in Donetsk. These were people that were selling homegrown fruit and vegetables, things, jam that they'd made at home. There was cloves of garlic, this kind of thing. So these are really poor people. This is a poor district of Donetsk, Kirovsky. It's about 12 miles, I guess, from Avdiivka, but it's close to Mariinka and other frontline areas where Ukrainian forces are. And this is from where Ukrainian forces launched their attacks into these civilian areas. So on arrival, it was immediate. There was a scene of carnage. It was horrific. I can't begin to explain to you just the scene that we found there. There were bodies everywhere. The first thing that I saw was an old woman, and she'd been cut in half. We saw feet, arms, legs all over the road. There was blood everywhere, and it's really difficult to describe that. And I tried to do my best to describe it when I was recording on the scene, but it's the stench of death and the fear and the anger amongst the people. The people there. There were soldiers there, or military. I guess the investigators that turn up. They come to the scene afterwards, and these are the people that determine which kind of missiles, artillery, and weapons were used. And these are hardened people that turn up to scenes like this quite often. And I saw them crying. People were crying. Understandably, it was beyond anything that I've ever seen before, and I've seen a lot of these kind of scenes over the years in my reporting and in my journalism. So this was very clearly a targeted attack, and this is what the people on the ground said. The attack took place. The first weapons came in. The first strike was at about 10 o'clock in the morning. So this was just after the holidays. So you have to remember that in Russia, the holiday period seems to go on forever. You know, they have New Christmas, Old Christmas, they have the New Year, the Orthodox New Year, and then Epiphany. So this was a few days after Epiphany. So Russia is, and Donetsk is still in that kind of holiday period, and people were coming out to do their shopping on a Sunday morning as per usual. And as the authorities said, and as was very clear when we arrived there, this was an attack that took place at peak time. So this was a busy marketplace, and this area was very, very busy. All the only things that are around there are people's homes and shops. So this isn't an area where there was any military presence anywhere nearby. Nothing. So there are no air defenses. There are no military. There are no military bases. The people that were killed were not soldiers. These were men and women, poor men and women from the Donetsk Republic, the people that have suffered daily and incessant attacks. So I've been back to the scene maybe 3 times now. We're going to go back again. By the time this comes out, we'd have probably visited again. And we've spoken to many, many people there, people that have lost loved ones. A woman who said that 4 of her friends were killed in one spot. And I mean, it's difficult to put into words how they're feeling. They're feeling, this is a community that's traumatized, a community in suffering and deep shock and pain. And the people are very, very angry. But the one thing that happened after I was reporting on this across social media and in other outlets where people try quickly to discredit those reports. And they do it very, very quickly. There's like an online army of these, of trolls, essentially. I think, this is a coordinated response, quite clearly. And whatever they do, what they say is wrong, quite clearly, but they sow the seeds of doubt. So I heard all sorts of things like this attack didn't happen at all. It was staged, as if I mean, it's laughable because, there's no way that this could have happened. They staged this, in case Steve Sweeney just happens to be listening in and discovers that there's been an attack and turns up and then finds all. I mean, I saw them. I saw the bodies. I saw the limbs. I saw the blood. This definitely happened. It wasn't staged. It wasn't faked. The other thing that people were saying, this is a false flag. It was Russia that carried out this attack, which again is obviously clearly nonsense, and we can prove it's provable nonsense. But they use like amateurish geolocation techniques, and they think that that they've worked out the trajectory that there were 19, by the way, just to let people know, there were 19 strikes in the area, not all on the marketplace. They were in different areas. 27 people were killed in the market. There was another maintenance worker who was killed in a drone attack as well. What was he doing? Just simply fixing his house. That was it. And he was taken out in a drone strike. And we know the trajectory it came from because we can, we know that we have eyewitnesses. We have obviously the evidence from. There's ways that we can work out the trajectory. It depends on the impact craters and the shrapnel and the splash and all of these kind of things that we look at when we determine which direction it came from. In a few days' time, we'll have that pinpointed pretty much exactly where it came from, the exact point. We know it came from Ukrainian-held territory. There's absolutely no question about that whatsoever. This is anybody that's trying to blame Russia is lying to you, and deliberately so. They're trying to shift blame for what is a war crime. This was a war crime carried out with Western.
I was just going to ask you about that because, as you know, yesterday there was a plane shot down with several POWs, Ukrainian POWs, that were set to be arranged to be made in prisoner swap, and they shot down with 3 missiles. Unfortunately, these missiles happen to be US made, right? And as an American, well, I'm an American in exile, but American nonetheless, it's really stunning and awful for me to see the amount of carnage around the world that's being perpetrated by the American weapons that are being provided to Ukraine and to Israel and to other countries that are just using them. And what's stunning to me also is Kiev's just disregard for human life, their own citizens. And if you could talk a little bit about the war crime itself and the war crimes that you've seen, because these weren't, there was no military targets in this particular attack on the market. Obviously it was real. Elliot Higgins is the person who kind of runs that troll farm, the NAFO troll farm, which is losing its own steam, I think. But it is a very coordinated effort on social media to suppress the truth. And the truth is that the US and UK are supplying weapons to Ukraine. And those weapons are being used en masse to destroy and harm civilians particularly in the Donbas region. So could you talk a little bit about the war crimes and what that means and the definition of it in your eyes as a journalist?
Well, I mean, that's a very big question because to talk about that in detail would take me hours, I would guess, to talk about the war crimes that are committed here, because these are war crimes that happen every single day. Targeting civilians is a war crime, right? Okay, so we know this, and we do know that every single day, without fail, there are NATO Western supplied weapons, 155 millimeter weapons that are crashing into not air defenses, not military bases, but they're crashing into babushkas' homes. They're careering through their living rooms, plowing through their apartments, and they are killing people. I would say indiscriminately, but I'm not quite convinced that it's as indiscriminate as we think it is. I think a lot of this is targeted. For example, let's say in the summer of last year, maybe I can't remember the exact month, maybe August, September time, the end of the summer, I reported on an attack on a hospital, and this attack had caused some damage to the hospital. The hospital was able to function partially, but there'd been quite a lot of serious damage at a hospital. This is in a place called Makiivka, which is a mining town just outside of Donetsk city. And what happened reminded me very much of, or actually when I heard the news, it reminded me of this rather the other way around. But if you recall, at the start of the Israeli assault on Gaza, there was an incident in which a hospital was struck, and it was clearly an Israeli attack. And if you remember, we had the whole of the Israeli machine, the propaganda machine, went into overdrive, and they said it was Hamas that had carried out this attack, and it was a Hamas. They made all sorts of logical somersaults to try and disprove the fact that it was an Israeli missile that targeted the hospital. Obviously, since then they've destroyed many more hospitals, but just claimed that it was a Hamas base. So anyway, this was very familiar to me, because when I reported on this attack on the hospital in Makiivka, again, I was subjected to all sorts of abuse. I received death threats from people, but there was very serious. I had to take obviously those very seriously. People threatened to a lot of these, and I'll come on to this a little bit later perhaps, were friends of the British mercenaries that are fighting on the Ukrainian side. In the conflict, and a lot of them were issuing what I said were very serious threats against me. They published my home address online. Fortunately, it was a very old home address from about 25 years ago or something.
Website that I'm on as well, the kill list, or is this in addition to?
In addition to that, of course, I'm on the kill list. I first appeared on the kill list because I reported about the allegations of the children that Ukraine says have been kidnapped by Russia. These 20,000 children or whatever that they say have been kidnapped by Russia, and they're charging Vladimir Putin with war crimes at the International Criminal Court. Well, I met a lot of these people that were supposedly kidnapped, and they told a very different story, of course. They were saying, wow, this was something for them, that it was relief from being in a war zone. They were taken out of a war zone. They were in a summer camp with their families. A lot of them, their mothers and fathers went with them, not all of them, but some of them did, and they had such a wonderful time. They want to go back, and of course, why wouldn't they? Because they were taken out of an area like Donetsk, and these are people that really live again in the outskirts of the city, the frontline areas that are pounded every day by artillery shells, where the children can't sleep in their bed at night. They have to sleep in hallways.
Isn't it interesting, Steve, how when Russia actually puts the children in safety and moves them with their families to another location, that's called kidnapping. But when, in Israel, in Gaza, I mean, when Israel just targets like children, schools and UN training centers and hospitals and kindergartens, that's the US still says that's not a war crime. It's mind-boggling.
The whole case against Vladimir Putin is an absolute absurdity. I mean, it's beyond anything. And the thing is, if you read the Western reports, like I do, and I read one in the Telegraph, because the Daily Telegraph, this is one of Britain's broadsheet newspapers, sits alongside the Times as one of these so-called very respectable newspapers, although I think its standards have slipped greatly in the last few years. But it's quite well respected, and they carried this story, and they had a journalist who and they created this whole thing about the kidnapping of children, and it was essentially based on a couple of anecdotes. Right? They've not been to the camps, they've not met the people, they've not been on the ground. They've carried out a lot of these interviews from London, and essentially, I think they had one person whose two teenage children begged to go to a summer camp in Crimea, and this is one of the camps or one of the children's centres that has now been closed down or sanctioned or whatever. But they went there. begged their mother to let them go. So they went there. And as teenagers do, they got bored very, very quickly and decided they wanted to come home. So they said to their mum, look, we're bored, we want to come home. Their mother contacted the camp. The camp said, well, it's pretty dangerous to leave here now because the only route out means you're going across an active war zone. So they said it's not safe for us to take them back. And she complained about it and said this was them being kidnapped, when of course it was the authorities saying, no, we're keeping them safe from potentially being killed and crossing through a war zone. In the end, their mother went to pick them up on her own, and she was allowed to pick them up, and they went and they started a new life in Kiev. So, but for the Telegraph, this was evidence that children in Ukraine are being kidnapped by Russians and indoctrinated, and it's pure evil. So, this is the kind of stuff that passes for journalism in the West, unfortunately, nowadays. And they don't do they don't come and report from the ground. So they don't report. For example, I can tell you many things that I've seen. So, for example, in Gorovka, which is an hour or so away from Donetsk city, I reported on a firefighter who was killed after a missile struck his the fire station where he worked. Now, if that had happened in any other city, if that had happened in Lvov or Kiev, it would be front page news everywhere, and there would be calls, of course, for Russia to be charged with war crimes. But it didn't make a ripple. It wasn't even reported. It didn't even make like what we call a nib, a news in brief. There was nothing about it at all. And I mean, just recently, 2 days ago, there was an emergency worker killed here in a drone strike in Donetsk city. Again, not a murmurer, nothing in the West. Ambulance drivers, paramedics. There was a paramedic wounded in an attack in Yasinovacha very recently, in which another 8 people were wounded. Again, nothing. Again, 2 days ago, 2 people killed, elderly people killed in a drone strike. Elderly people are sitting in their home killed in a drone strike. Again, nothing. And these are war crimes committed on a daily basis. The hospital attack I was talking about before we got into the child abduction allegations, that this hospital was partially destroyed. It was damaged. I spoke to people that work in the hospital. I spoke to people. They said they hid in the basement during the attack. There was a huge Ukrainian shelling of the area. One of the nurses there took me to his home, and he showed me how, now I'll share this. You might be able to see the footage now, but I was in his house and he showed me how the artillery shell had crashed through into his kitchen and caused a reasonable amount of damage there. And again, I was told this didn't happen. First of all, it didn't happen. It's a fake. Then I was told, actually, it did happen, but it was Ukrainian forces struck a Russian ammo dump nearby. Now, they use these geolocation techniques, but they said that there was a disused housing block. Now, all I can tell you is I was there. I was on the ground. I was on the scene. I spoke to many witnesses. I spoke to the local community. Now, the story that this was a Russian ammo dump simply doesn't add up for a number of reasons. One, I was in the area, and the road and I drove down the road where this housing complex, they say the Russian weapons were. The road wasn't sealed off, right? Normally you would expect, if they don't want you to see it, you would expect maybe that road to be sealed off. It wasn't. I could drive down it freely. There was no evidence of any remnants of the missiles or the weapons that they say had cooked. And it would have caused, if it destroyed this hospital or partially destroyed the hospital, it would have done the same to this housing complex. It didn't. And of course, if you're speaking to the local community, they would be extremely angry that they had been put at such great risk by having this huge Russian ammo dump nearby. And at least one person, I mean, these people are not afraid of talking, by the way. These are people that will quite happily express their anger. And they would have done so had there been an ammo dump. So they were very clear about what happened. But also on that very same day, in total, 9 medical facilities were targeted. So if they're saying this one was 9, 9 across the Donetsk Republic, 9 were targeted in one day. I mean, I've been to.
Unbelievable.
I spoke to a wonderful guy actually. I mean, he's an incredible guy. He's a surgeon, medical director at a hospital here, and he described living here as Donetsk roulette. That's what he said. He said you never know what's going to happen when you wake up. And I interviewed him and in his office, and I noticed that the window behind him was boarded up. And he said, yes, there was an attack. He was in the office when it happened. He said he was lucky to survive. But I was there because, again, this is another war crime, but I was in the hospital that day because I was following up on a story about a child, 12-year-old child, Volodya, his name is, and he had his leg torn off by a Ukrainian missile, a Western-supplied Ukrainian missile. We were on the scene soon after. We met his family. You can imagine that they were distraught, and the scene was again, there was blood everywhere, and still where he was, you know, I could, you know, I saw. You know, I saw it with my own eyes, and I saw the crater where the hole, sorry, where the artillery shell came crashing through his bedroom, and it was while he was asleep. So I went to see him in the hospital. I mean, he's a 12-year-old boy. It was the last day of school holidays. He was looking forward to having fun with his friends, like any other child in the West, you know, living in safety does. And he was looking forward to a summer of, you know, doing what he enjoys the most, and a lot of those are outdoor activities. Of course, people in Donetsk can't go to school. This is another point that we should stress, because you'll remember the speech by Petro Poroshenko, where he says that about the children hiding in basements, and you know, I remember seeing a story about you know, they were saying children in Kharkov, oh, they're about to go to school underground, or they're preparing underground schools for the kids there because, you know, because of Russian missiles. Well, children haven't been able to go to school here for years, right? Because their schools are shelled. I've met a teacher, and maybe you can see some of this footage now, but I met a teacher who had both his legs blown off in a Ukrainian shelling attack. And this is while in the West, certainly in Britain, the teaching unions are being asked to support the Ukrainian war effort. They're being asked to supply them with money so that they can carry out these kind of attacks on their fellow teachers in Ukraine. And they're being lied to, though. They're being told that the teaching unions, certainly here in Donetsk, don't support it, but they're being told the Ukrainian teaching unions support this. So yeah, they're trying to drum up those levels of support. But I was in this hospital, like I said, to speak to Volodya, and you know, he said the same thing that everybody does here. I said, "What do you want for the future?" And he said, "Peace. Right. I want peace." But they don't want to leave. That's the thing. You know, people often say, "Well, why don't they just leave?" Well, where to? Where do they leave to? You know, these areas are well, not only are they poor areas, but it's their home. It's where their families are. It's where they grew up. Why should they leave? Why should they be forced out by Ukrainian forces? And just a point on that, because even amongst so-called progressives in the West, the anti-war movement and you know, these organizations that describe themselves as leftist or progressive, and I count myself as one of those. But I think they've lost their way a bit, because you know, this
I think pretty much the left movement has become not only fascist in both America and Great Britain and in Germany and some other European countries, but they've become amazingly aggressive with stripping away consent about going to war, and they've become warlike. They're all about, you know, look what's happening in Gaza. Look what's happening look what's happening, and the support they're giving.
This is a point I want to make
war against Russia, which that's what it is. It's a war that the West is trying to fight against Russia, and let's not call it anything else, because that's what it is, right?
And that's a point I want to make, actually, Tara, if I can, because people are rightly seeing what's happening in Gaza. And they're right to be horrified. This is a massacre. This is a genocide on an unprecedented scale, unbelievable scale. This, you know, it's and it's unfolding in front of our eyes.
Yes.
But if you want to know what would happen in Donbass if Russian troops were to leave, as they keep saying, Russia must leave. If Russian troops left Donbass, you would see exactly what you're seeing in Gaza now.
Absolutely. I agree with you. I agree. There's no question. Ever since going back before 2014, but most recently 2014, when Victoria Nuland, when the West, was exposed for putting in a coup.
Yeah, exactly.
But I wanted to ask you a bigger umbrella question, because I was actually discussing this yesterday about the U.S. The U.S. is, as you know, entering a presidential election, in case you haven't noticed. And it's quite heated and controversial, because who knows what's going to be happening. But as far as the Democrats are being viewed as the warmongers, as the party of war, because they just keep starting more and more endless wars, and the military-industrial complex has completely kind of taken over. And I would say that Great Britain seems to be the lapdog as well of the US. But what I was saying yesterday was that, you have 60% or more of people, of citizens, of US citizens, that do not want this proxy war in Ukraine against Russia. They do not want it. They want attention paid to their own problems, which is falling apart of infrastructure, high prices, and people are desperate for, decent work, decent wages. And it's very negative right now in the US. And then you have the UK. So I wanted to ask you about the UK. The UK just turned around and gave billions of pounds to Ukraine for more weapons. What are you hearing from UK citizens on the ground? Like, I know you might still have some connection with citizens there that might have a different opinion than their government. What are you hearing? And are you hearing the same thing I am, which is that most of the citizens feel like this is a war without consent and they don't want it?
I travel back to Britain reasonably often. The last time I was there was back in October, and obviously people know me there, and they know that I live in Russia, so they speak to me quite a lot about their thoughts and their feelings on the situation, on the conflict. Now, things have changed, I think, quite clearly since February 2022, when the special military operation began. When it began, of course, it was on the front page of every single newspaper. It was the headline on every news channel.
Every day.
And it was almost like an overload. And it was the most baseless propaganda that I think I've seen for a very, very long time. And even worse, actually, than when the war in Iraq was taking place. I mean, there was still it was pretty bad then, don't get me wrong, but it was nothing like we've seen.
But there was a solid anti-war movement with Iraq, even though it didn't do any good, but there's still like a lot of loud voices, right?
I mean, there were, particularly around Iraq. Of course, in Britain, we saw 2 million people on the streets, a huge anti-war movement, and that kind of did shift the media in a way, because they had to kind of be a little bit in step with public anger and public feeling on that. There was also this deep distrust and in fact hatred of Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister at the time, when George W. was at the helm in the United States. So, but I think, we're looking, that was 20 years ago. Right, 21 years ago now that this took place. Things have changed dramatically since then. The media landscape, media ownership has changed. We've very sadly lost just recently John Pilger, one of the most outstanding journalists of our generation, and a strong anti-war voice. Robert Fisk, we lost as well. Again, one of my journalistic heroes. But you've seen these kind of people, even before they passed away, they were now treated, these are award-winning journalists, right? These are people that have uncovered and reported from global hotspots across the world, and they've won award after award quite correctly, because they've uncovered all sorts of atrocities committed by the imperialist powers. But there was a concerted effort. All of a sudden, these were people that had columns in like the Guardian and the Independent, these sort of broadly central, left of centre newspapers in Britain. They would appear on television, but then you could see them being marginalised. Seymour Hersh is a classic example. I mean, he's a guy who uncovered the torture at Abu Ghraib. He uncovered the My Lai massacre, and of course he uncovered or he reported on what happened in or didn't happen in the gas attack, the chemical attack in Syria,
pipeline,
and Duma, for that they've been punished by being forced out to the margins. These people are now not seen as the incredible journalists that they are, but they're painted almost like as cranks, as weirdos, as propagandists. When the opposite,
conspiracy theories, right? Yeah,
exactly. And the opposite is the case. Is that the people that are on the ground doing honest, decent journalism and reporting and investigative work are now pushed to the side because that window has now narrowed. But on the flip side of it, I wrote an article actually debunking the BBC who moved from 2014 until 2022. They were warning about the dangers of the Azov, the right sector, and the neo-Nazis in Ukraine. They were very clear about that, both in their online and their reporting, their broadcasts. They made quite a number of documentaries and special packages reporting on this, and then all of a sudden they flipped. And Ros Atkins, this guy's name, it was almost like a hurrah for the black shirts moment. I called my article "Hurrah for the Azov." This was a famous headline in Britain from the Daily Mail back when the Nazis came to power in Germany. And what they were saying then, Lord Rothermere was the owner of the Daily Mail, was saying, well, this is just the Nazis aren't that bad. The violence is just a small minority. We shouldn't be swayed by these kind of reports. It's exaggerated. Right, it mirrored exactly what Ros Atkins did in this BBC report, which hopefully you can see the report on the screen, and you can have a link to my article. But I think what happened is people have now more of a distrust of the media than they did back in the times of the Iraq War.
Well, in the U.S. right now, it's I think 75% of U.S. citizens do not trust the mainstream media. Which I mean, and they're pretty. I mean, the elites are pretty tone deaf about it because they don't care. I think we've reached a point where they sort of give a half-assed effort. There you have it, right? But it's not sincere anymore. They don't have to be. They control everything, so they don't really have to. It's just like you've seen these massive demonstrations for a ceasefire and an outcry from citizens all over the world, and it's just collectively ignored, and it's continuing without consent.
In Britain, actually, I'll come on to Ukraine. Back to Ukraine in just a second, and what the British people feel. But I think there's an important point about the ceasefire now demands. And we've seen. I was back in Britain in October. I attended one of the demonstrations, and it's the biggest I've seen since the peak of the anti-war movement. And I think 500,000 maybe people on the streets of London at this demonstration, and you can tell that this is rattling the establishment. The authorities are scared because, first of all, there were calls for the marches to be banned, and this failed. Then there was a concerted effort to paint it as a Hamas march, right? A pro-Hamas march. They were calling it pro-Hamas, pro-terrorist marches. And almost every kind of media outlet was lining up their guests, calling on them to condemn Hamas. And these were people, I mean, there was it was quite difficult to watch, really, very uncomfortable to watch when they were getting guests on who'd lost 5 family members, for example, and then asking them before they conducted the interview, talking about their family members, to condemn Hamas, as though that anything that they said, if they didn't condemn Hamas, it delegitimized anything they said. So there was, I mean, that's still ongoing, but what they're doing now is policing these demonstrations with, they're monitoring the slogans that are acceptable on banners and placards. Some comrades of mine, some friends of mine from the party I belong to were arrested simply because they were handing out leaflets in support of the Palestinian right to resist. and they had about 50 police officers surrounding the stall. They were arrested. They were taken off. I don't know what's going to happen with that case, whether they're going to appear in court. But also there was a booklet that we have highlighting how Zionism is a tool of imperialism, which again has been subjected to a ban. There's been an attempt to ban this. So they're very tightly controlling that narrative, not just in the media, not just politically, but they're also mobilizing the police en masse to these demonstrations. They're encouraging people to report any slogans that are deemed pro-Hamas or I guess, Israel. Is the thing. So they're really trying to shut that down, to delegitimize it as best they can. But if we come back to Ukraine very quickly, I mean, really not because of what's happening in Gaza, but it's pretty much slipped off the agenda of the main news organizations. Now, like I said at the beginning of the SMO back in February 2022, of course, people have a natural response to that kind of thing. I don't blame them. They're seeing, they're having images. Excuse me. The images are reaching them through their television screens every day of what they see of people covered in dust and blood and bandaged up. These poor people that they're seeing being struck by missiles, their country's coming under attack, they're being forced to flee. And a human response to that, to any kind of tragedy, humans are innately good people, right? Innately, I think it's only later when they get corrupted or whatever, but they see that and they want to help. So they were taking in the refugees, they were sympathetic. And of course, they're told this is evil Russia, Putin's evil. It's the same playbook we've seen to justify every war over the years. But as time's gone on, they've realized, actually, this isn't true. And my reporting, when they see it, they're quite shocked, because these images, the truth isn't getting through. But I think what's happened now is people are seeing, like we said, we've just seen this huge New Deal signed by Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, who's not been elected by the public. He's never been subjected to any kind of. He's not been subjected to any kind of election. Imagine that. It was, apart from, I mean, he was.
Yeah.
I mean, this was even since. I mean, we went through a calamity in Britain of, 1 minute it was Theresa May, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, and Rishi Sunak, all within a couple of months. And I was in Moscow at the time this was happening, and we were kind of laughing, really, and of course my Russian friends were saying, this is what you call democracy. That
Exactly.
Britain became a laughing stock at that stage, and totally understandably. So we're now seeing all of this money, all of these billions of pounds being put into fighting a war that is essentially nothing to do with Britain, right? As far as the British people are concerned, they don't understand why this is happening. But at the same time, the cost of living. I say it's a cost of living, crisis. I think that's a polite way of putting it. I think it's, this is a austerity.
Well, I read yesterday, not to interrupt you, Steve, but I read yesterday that there are several thousand businesses across Great Britain and Ireland that are going down, that are going to be closing and shuttered. And is this part of? I mean, you have the Ukrainian, a lot of Ukrainian refugees were accepted into Ireland and some, into Great Britain. But is this a result of Brexit and that both combined, or what is that? What is happening?
I don't think it's a result. I don't think we can put it down to Brexit. Certainly not. I was myself. I was a supporter of Brexit. I think I can talk about that another time, perhaps the reasons behind that. But
fair enough.
For me, Brexit, the European Union, is a neoliberal economic bloc that really only exists as a state of imperialist power. It's a capitalist machine, and all it does is across the Eurozone, it implements forced austerity amongst the people. Now, in Britain, I think that again, this is not austerity. Is a political choice made by the ruling class, made by the government. It doesn't need to be that way. There's no reason that that hospitals should be starved of funds. There's no reason that all of these businesses should be closing down. There's no reason that that public services across the board are being hit by massive cuts. People's wages are being depressed, inflation's rising, the cost of living's rising, rent's rising, food prices are rising, bills are astronomical. Before I left London, I think 1 month gas and electricity bill was, I remember, it was more than £400 for 1 month.
Oh my
Right?
goodness. Wow.
Yeah, exactly. Oh my goodness. Right, that's very polite. So
That's
people
a big hike. Yeah.
Yeah. So people are now stuck in this position, and between heating and eating, they're choosing whether to have their heat on in the winter or to buy food. People are now, when I was back the last time, I said in October, this is anecdotal stuff, but we can, this is happening across the country, that people I know, one is a senior social worker, the other, again, was a medical secretary. They both had very reasonably well-paid jobs, in Britain. These were seen as as good careers. People have gone to university to train, and they're doing good work. But they now are 2 weeks after they get paid, are visiting food banks because they can't afford to buy food. They can't afford to pay bills. They can't afford to pay the rent. Right. They can't afford to pay the mortgage. People are really struggling. My mother, for example, she's an old woman, and I remember just before Christmas she got a bill doubling her gas and electricity. I mean, this is just and so people see this, and they see that when they go to the supermarket now, the goods that they buy, those bills have risen. So people are looking at cheaper brands, or they're looking at we have the best before. The things that are being reduced because they're about to go out of date. More people are using those if they're not indeed using food banks. So on the one hand, they're seeing this, that they can't enjoy life as they did, as normal, not even 2 years ago. So right. People are really, really suffering. Like you said, businesses are closing down. People are desperate. Really, really desperate. So you saw a little bit of a wave of a kickback on this industrial actions, strike action taken by public sector workers, nurses. I mean, nurses using food banks. These are people in work. Wow. Right? This is not employed people. This is people that are in work. They're working in the public sector. They're working in our hospitals. These are the people that during, however you want to view it, but during the COVID crisis, when the country was locked down, these were the people that were going to work every day. These were the people that the government said were heroes. They could, I don't know about the United States, but in Britain, every Thursday, they were asking people
to work and be on the dole. Yeah.
Yeah. No, clap for the health workers, they're heroes. But this was all, they don't care about these people at all, of course. They cared about them.
Do you think then, because I mentioned earlier what I thought it is it like the US, because the US is having the same exact thing, just on a larger scale as far as, there's 600 and some thousand people that are homeless, living in the streets, right? And these are families. These aren't just, drug users, right? There's, of course, the fentanyl crisis in the US, but and other drug problems, but besides that, it's just the working wage isn't enough for housing. There's a housing crisis. There's a housing crisis in Ireland. I know that for sure.
Housing crisis.
I don't know about Great Britain, but there's a full-on housing crisis in Ireland. So is this because of all the defense spending that Great Britain is doing, or what is the crux of it? Is it corruption in your eyes?
Well, I mean, it's capitalism, really. It's capitalism in crisis, but when capitalism is in crisis,
right?
Yeah, exactly. How do they get their way out of a crisis? They wage wars. They wage wars, and this is exactly what we've seen throughout history. So, of course, people are now starting to make the link, and they're saying, "Well, hang on a minute. If you can find money to kill people, you can find money to help people." So this is a matter of political priorities and political choices. They can always, they can't ever find money to lift people out of poverty, but they can find money to bomb people that are already in poverty. They can, they can't lift them out of poverty. So this is a really intense battle at the moment, I think. People are seeing, well, all of this money for war is not in our name. Right, we don't want to be bombing. We don't want to be killing Russians. We don't want to be killing the people here in Donetsk. They were horrified at this kind of thing. What they want to see is
I want to say that 2 days ago, a UK prominent, a couple of prominent people in the UK, in the military, of course, put out a thing saying that UK citizens need to get citizen army training because they should be ready for a ground fight. So they're talking about sending ground troops into Ukraine. Is this just more fantasy Or is this, like something to be worried about?
Yeah, sorry, there was just a big explosion then.
Okay.
Defenses. I think. Look, this was one of the military leaders. This was the head of the army in Britain, and he released. He made this statement. It was covered in the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph, of course. And he was saying, look, that the Britain's military has been so decimated over the years. It's so weak, and it has been. This is one of the biggest gripes of the armed forces, is that they've been subjected to cuts in numbers, cuts to their budget. And he's saying, look, if we're going to fight Russia, we're going to need to force people to sign up to the military, conscription. And I mean, this is nonsense, of course. I mean, I think this is, again, a part of I think there's two things going on here. This is partly the military saying, give us more money because we don't have we don't have enough funding. And of course, if you look, Britain has sent a lot of its military equipment and a lot of its weapons. This has come out of existing stock, the same as in the United States, of course, existing stock that is now on the front lines, or was on the front lines in Ukraine. Most of it's been blown up. But the missiles and whatever, but they're talking about manpower is what they're talking about. They're saying they don't have enough people to fight a war against Russia. Of course, a ground war against Russia is never going to happen. This is again part. It's
a bad idea.
They would, I think I posted something on Twitter, X or whatever you call it these days, saying, this is absurd. I mean, the people will refuse conscription anyway, but it's just a fantasy that's not going to happen. There will never be a ground war between Britain and Russia. What they do instead, as we know, is there's a team of mercenaries. We saw with the Russian strike against the French mercenaries recently, 60 killed, 20 or more of those were wounded. But now, and the names of these have started to be released. But also there are British mercenaries. Again, I can talk about this probably for a very long time, but I track the British mercenaries and their actions, their activities, and where they are. Fortunately, because these people are, one, they're fairly stupid, but two, they're such egotists that they post a lot of information about themselves online because they want to. They're creating a narrative about themselves as these plucky heroes going off to fight in Ukraine. The reality, of course, is very different. These are people that are, there's nothing heroic about sending a drone into a babushka's living room. And there's nothing heroic about firing an RPG into a civilian area. There's nothing heroic about training the far right Azov battalion to carry out atrocities against civilian people. They're, shooting dead men and women in the street, firing at humanitarian centres where aid is being collected and distributed. There's nothing heroic about that at all. That's the reality of these people. These people are able to cross in and out of Britain freely. They have admitted to killing Russians, and they've admitted, I know that they've killed Russians. One of them in particular, Pinner, has spent 2 years training Azov at the height of their atrocities and the war crimes that they were committing. These are people that were holed up in the Azov-style steel plant. I've been there. We're about to make a film about that as well, speaking to people who will tell the reality, the people that were holed up there, that were held hostage by these so-called heroes of Mariupol. They're not heroes at all. These are war criminals, people that have committed some of the most horrific crimes against the people. We're now starting to see those people being put on trial. And again, this is not reported in the West. What the West are doing, and the Daily Mail ran a piece calling the heroes, saying, look at these people in a courtroom. They're being starved. They're being treated really badly. They're being put on trial for the crimes that they committed. I mean, these are you're drumming up or trying to drum up sympathy for neo-Nazis. That's that's the reality of this. But of course, they're not reporting on the trials themselves and the accusations, and in fact, the convictions now. And again, we're seeing a lot more of these each day, each week. There's more and more people that are being sentenced for their for their crimes. So we know that Britain will use proxies, as they've done in Syria, we know, and a lot of the same people that were fighting in Syria have swapped one conflict zone for another. They were in Syria, now they're in Ukraine, and I do know that all of them have links to British intelligence. All of them do. All of them have links to British intelligence. They even admit it. They're quite stupid enough to do that. They admit to Aidan Aslin, Mesa Gifford, Sean Pinner, just to name three of them. And others have been working with Ukrainian intelligence. Sam Newey, unfortunately, who was killed in Ukraine, was working with the Ukrainian intelligence. We know that, and I mean it's a very, very murky world. But that's how Britain will operate. It will be clandestine operations. I do know that before the SMO began, that British military trainers were inside, in fact, very close to the Donbass. They were training again these quite horrible people.
I have a question. This kind of leads me to, and we've got to wrap up our time together, and it's fascinating. And you have to come back on the show because there's so much information. But I wanted to now kind of ask you what your thoughts are about how this proxy war that the US and UK is fighting against Russia via Ukraine, how this ends. Like where, I was hoping maybe in the spring there would be peace talks, although yesterday you had that, the POWs, another war crime committed, you had the market, of course, with civilians. So obviously we're not close to peace negotiations even though Russia had tried several times, and then England, actually Great Britain intervened and, scrapped them, the ones in Turkey back in 2021, 22. So what are your thoughts on 22, excuse me, on where it goes from here and how it wraps up? Because right now, Ukrainian, according to the losses, they've lost a generation of men, in this. I mean, it's stunning the amount of loss of life. Like, where does it go from here?
I mean, that's the big question. How does this conflict end? I think we can safely say that this is a proxy war, and a proxy war that NATO, the West, the US, and Britain can't win. And I think that I think they're at a stage now where they've come to accept that. We're seeing a very much a shift in the tone from politicians, but also from the armed forces, from NATO. They're talking in very, very different terms now about the conflict. Of course, this was one that was going to deliver a swift or a Ukrainian victory, that they were going to regain control of what they call their lost territory. By that they mean the Donbass, but also they mean Crimea. If you remember, there was, I think it was last year, just before the counteroffensive started, there was talk about a beach party in Crimea. They were, that was the big thing. And instead of that, they've not been able to move an inch. Barely an inch. They barely took any ground in this counteroffensive at all. Russia just held a defensive line, and once the counteroffensive had failed, now they've started pushing forward. The battle for Avdiivka is ongoing at the moment, and Russia has made. People say, well, why doesn't in the West, a lot of people are saying, well, why doesn't this just happen quickly? Why doesn't Russia just pour loads of troops in and take it? It's not quite as simple as that, obviously. Avdiivka is very well fortified. It's been a Ukrainian stronghold for at least 10 years. And it's an area that they use, again, to shell civilian areas, along with Makiivka. Makiivka, we know, has now fallen. That's now under Russian control. Avdiivka, I think, is not too far behind, but I think once Avdiivka comes under Russian control, and it will do, it's just a matter of when that happens. I think once it comes under Russian control, it's game over for Ukraine. But you've seen this shift in rhetoric. I mean, on the geopolitical stage, you're very right. Of course, there was a peace deal on the table that had been agreed by both sides, and it was Boris Johnson, when he was Prime Minister of Britain, who flew over to Kiev in April 2022, and he scuppered that. He scuttled it. basically said to Zelensky, you can't sign this, we need the war to continue. And Zelensky bowed, of course. But now we're seeing internally inside Ukraine, we're seeing this quite public criticism now of Zelensky. Of course, Vitaly Klitschko, the mayor of Kiev, has been quite open about it. He said that Zelensky is now moving towards an authoritarian dictatorship. I mean, this is the one thing that people talk about, peace and democracy in Ukraine. There is no democracy in Ukraine. It's shut down every news organization. It's banned opposition political parties. The left are being persecuted. They're either in prison or in hiding. The Communist Party has been banned. All of its assets turned over to the state. So elections have been scrapped. So I don't know what these democratic
and they've been banning religion as well. The Orthodox Church going off to the Orthodox, which 85% of Ukrainians are Russian Orthodox.
Exactly. So we're seeing all of these, so that, let's, dismiss this notion that Ukraine is any kind of democracy. To see this, the people that were very close, Arestovich, for example, who was a Ukrainian, who's very close to Zelensky, is now gone completely full circle, and he's extremely critical. He's saying that the conflict must come to an end, and he's voicing very sharp criticisms of Zelensky. There's this talk about maybe Zelensky might be swept aside or moved or whatever. But of course, we're seeing there's I think disagreements between him and Zaluzhny as well, the head of the armed forces. So those cracks are starting to show at the very top, even with the incident with the military transport aircraft being shot down over Belgorod. You saw Gerashenko in the parliament was saying, he was very vocal about what's happening and being kept in the dark about what's happening, very critical of Zelensky for effectively ignoring what was happening and leaving people in the dark and refusing to comment. So there's obviously some very deep problems there. I think also, I mean, what happens in Ukraine isn't going to be decided in Ukraine. What happens in Ukraine will be decided, I think, by the United States and by Britain. Their support is, they're looking for a way out. That's incredibly clear. They're looking for an exit, and that they have to find one that they can sell to the American public as some kind of victory. I mean, Biden, goodness knows he needs something, because he's surely not going to win the presidential election. I mean, well, the polls suggest that he can't. So I think that will be on the mind of the Democrats. Of course, they need something to give Biden some kind of boost. So I think it will be determined by, we have two important elections next year, is the US presidential election and the general election in Britain. So there's likely, I suggest, I mean, certainly, I mean, you can tell me more about the United States, but it seems very likely that there's going to be a change in administration. I would say thankfully in a way, because I think, I'm not talking about Biden, but Anthony Blinken seemed to be the most dangerous man, I think, on the planet.
Victoria Nuland, Anthony Blinken, and that's the thing, it's if they get Nikki Haley, who's supposed to be Republican, she's funded by Democrats. She's funded by like Reade Hoffman, who's linked to all of those. And it's the war machine. So you have the duopoly, as they call it. Yeah. But before we depart here, because I know you're busy and you have to go on with your day. Would you mind telling our audience how they can find you and follow your work? We're going to be featuring some of your clips. Obviously, we'll have your descriptions down below on YouTube and Rumble and Odyssey and all the platforms that the show will come out on. But could you kind of direct where people can find you and follow you and ask you more questions?
Absolutely. If people want to, and I'm very happy to answer questions, and whatever people want to know, I'm more than happy to try and answer as best I can. If you want to follow me on my Twitter or X handle is @SweeneySteve. So that's SWEENEYSTEVE. I have a Telegram channel, which is Steve Sweeney Journalist, and you can find me there. And I'm about to set up a YouTube channel under the same name. So that'll be Steve Sweeney Journalist, I think. But I'll send the links. Hopefully, the links will be included in the bio, so you can find.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. Again, Steve, thank you for coming. I know you're in a war zone. You're very brave. I just want to say that I don't think people realize how. Imagine, because I know that when you go to any kind of hotspot site where there's just been a bombing, they literally wait for journalists and first responders to come on the scene to bomb again. So it's so dangerous, the work that you do, but you're doing such good work bringing truth. And so thank you for what you're doing. And please know that it's noted how brave one has to be to try to bring truth in this time that we live in right now. There's not a lot of support for it. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right. Thank you everyone for joining us. We'll see you next week. And that's it for Politics of Survival. Take care.